Welcome to Minerva. Today we're going to be discussing the Knights of the Golden Circle. First of all, I'd like to introduce my co-host Duncan.
Hello!
We'd like to give you enough information that you can go away and then do your own study. Now this is a huge topic, so let's get into it. Who were the Knights of the Golden Circle? Well, to understand that, we have to understand some American history. Now during the American Civil War, that was fought out between the North and the South, or the Union and the Confederates. That was between 1861 and 1865, and it was linked to a belief on whether or not slavery should be legal. The Knights of the Golden Circle were born out of the civil rights clubs that were before the war, and it was actually formed by a gentleman called George Bickley, and that was around 1854. Now, Bickley wanted slavery to be legal, and he knew lots of people that did the same. So what he did was try to form a group of like-minded people into a semi-kind of secret society. Now, Bickley was a well-known man, he was a doctor, and he called a meeting to create the Knights of the Golden Circle with some other people that were influential within the area. Now, in Freemasonry, a group of people is called a lodge, but within the Knights of the Golden Circle, that was called a castle. You had an inner castle, which was the most influential members within that group, and you also had the Grand Castle, which was the overriding group that looked after all of the other castles. Now, these guys were completely pro-slavery, and they were very, very politically motivated. In fact, they were so politically motivated that they were building their own army. Now, the general idea was to create a golden circle around the south of America, Cuba, Mexico, the Caribbean, and that circle would be where they would own all of the land and work within that land. This was going to be their empire, and it had great resources. If you think about that area at that time, they would have been master exporters in the finest tobaccos, coffee, sugar, cotton, lots of really important things to export at the time, and of course things that would have given them lots and lots of money. Now, I've really enjoyed looking into this. I've been looking into this for a little while, trying to tee up this show. But what I'd like to know is, Duncan, what are your initial thoughts on this group, the KGC?
Yes, okay, thanks then. Yeah, it's another subject you've sent my way, which I know nothing about. But yeah, it's been very enjoyable learning about it. It's always nice to learn something new. I suppose the first point to say is also the disclaimer part. It's awkward talking about American history because I kind of aware how American history is, how it's being taught in America is changing and perceptions of it are different. And so we're already getting the information secondhand. We're getting it third hand now because we're seeing this transition of American history or how it's being perceived. And so who are we as Englishmen to look at it? And obviously we're going to go into topics of like slavery, etc., which is a hot topic in so many different ways and an awkward one to try to make sure it's being conveyed objectively. So all those being said, let's get into it. Yeah, the American Civil War. I suppose one of the interesting things in it, I think it's coming quite prevalent now, is yes, slavery is a primary factor, but it's not the only factor. It was not the only cause of the war, a major one, but not the only one. And I suppose we could relate it very much to our recent experiences with Brexit in England. So many times through that period of our own history, we have one group turning around and say, "Oh, you're all against immigration, and that's the part of it," and other people are saying, "No, it's all about freedom of movement," and other people are saying it's the economic part. Each one was a passionate concept for each group who had their opinions, but they were different points of argument for one thing. Were we going to stay in or come out of Europe? And to be honest, I think we need to look at, and I think it is happening now, we're looking at the Civil War history and seeing that it isn't just about slavery. It's a big thing about the South being concerned about being governed by a parliament that exists, a governing body that was up in the north of America, where its economic structure was totally different to the South. So how could they feel that they were really represented? Did they feel they're being governed by a party that, or a government bloc that had no relation to them? And of course, then again, we do go in this part of slavery, and the economic structure of the South was so different And no matter whether we question it on the concepts of ethics on slavery, for them at that time, what was happening in the South was simply working. I mean, we're still looking at a relatively young nation when we're looking at as America as a whole. We're looking at a point where there is a stabilization of what the structures are, although different in the North and the South. It was stabilizing. And so I suppose you have this thing in the South that happened where they're getting this oppressive feeling from what was happening in the North and coming down and say, look, you can't live this way anymore. For them, it's absolutely working. And so if they can't go north, then there's this ingenious system. So well, let's go south. Slavery works for us here. The land and the crops and the whole concept of if we went south and take over Mexico and the northern part of Southern America, then they would have built up their own country and would have had such a wealth that, unfortunately, there is that concept. Money is power, and they would have had such a nucleus of industry and money that they could have forced their own presence on the world stage. So you can understand the motivation for it. But for me, this entire story that comes engaging is, although we're looking at a political ideal and we're looking at it from political perspectives, we're not talking about Democrats versus Republicans, looking at the politics in America. We're talking about an actual secret society formed to try and create this environment. I mean, that's beyond Machiavellian. We're going into like the realms of like the James Bond thing. Is that they're not openly doing it. We're talking about a secret society building themselves to put in positions to create a country. That's a plot line for James Bond in itself. But I'll let you go into the secret society bit because it's just fascinating in its own right.
Well, thank you very much. Their plans, the KGC's plans, were exposed by two lovers. Now, this is a really interesting story. Essentially, two lovers are in a barn, in the mezzanine level of the barn at the top, and they're doing what they're doing. As they're doing that, in walk some KGC members. So, of course, everything goes silent, and they try not to move as to not be detected. Now, the KGC members continue to have a short meeting where they discuss a lot of their plans and what they are preparing to do. And once they leave, the two lovers go to the police and, of course, tell the police that story. So the police start to investigate, and, of course, they then start to break the plans of what the Knights of the Golden Circle are doing, and a mass expose starts to happen. There's also another great place to get information. It's a book by a member of the order, and that's actually what it's called. This person doesn't give their name, just a member of the order, in 1861. Having read the book, what you'll notice is that member hasn't reached the inner sanctum. He hasn't reached the inner temple or the inner castle. So he's just on the outer order, but he does, give us lots of information, which is really important to learn about the KGC and how they were operating. Now, it's an excellent book, and it starts all the way with the Southern civil rights clubs and takes it all the way up to the war, where things start to get, really interesting for the Knights of the Golden Circle. But when we read the book, it really does read like a secret society. There are lots of symbols. There are lots of there are degrees in which you would be initiated and then taken further into the Knights of the Golden Circle. And it all really reads like Freemasonry. So my question to you, Duncan, is, do you think this is linked in somehow to the Freemasons?
Ooh, I'm going to have to say a controversial yes. Not for the reason people expect. I'm not saying that Freemasonry has anything to do with this line of thinking or supportive of anything of this. It's just the case of, we know that Freemasonry was rife in the South. It was rife in America anyway, but very much it was in the South. And so if the gentry are the people behind this movement and they're all Masons, then there's a strong probability that connections would have happened through the Masonic network. In addition, with the structure of Freemasonry already existing, it seems like it's an ideal skeleton to carry on your own secret order, although Freemasonry is not a secret order, but it would easily be transformed into one with all the stuff that's actually there. But there's also another realism to this. Okay, so, as a Mason, you know that politics is banned as a topic to be discussed in a lodge. And that ruling goes back to the earliest parts of speculative masonry in the sense of like the early 1700s. But even though we know that as a fact, we also know from a fact of history that politics has been engaged in Freemasonry. During the Jacobite movement, there was a big concern that lodges were being used to recruit and promote Jacobite ideals. And we also have in 1799, we have the Unlawful Society Act that was coming into force in England, which if it went into official act, especially against Freemasonry, would have destroyed English Freemasonry. One of the concepts of this act of law was that nobody could take an oath if that was in a private ceremony, in a secret ceremony. And this was because the government was concerned that there were organizations existing that were swearing oaths of allegiance to usurp the government. And I mean, at that point we had two Grand Lodges, and both Grand Lodges were petitioning the Prime Minister, and luckily Freemasonry didn't get included because we proved that our oaths had nothing to do with usurping. And in fact, we have oaths to protect the Crown or the land that is our home, to be lawful. But even so, we have the evidence of that act of showing how politics and the fear of societies seem to go hand in hand. But the interesting thing, I mean, the thing that really does come to is there a Masonic connection is through certain characters. And one has to be this guy called Albert Pike. Now, if anybody researches Freemasonry, and even in England, he comes up as an early character. But actually in England, he's almost incidental. He has very little relation to what happens here. But in America and in South America, I mean, he's so revered. I mean, the famous 33 degrees of Freemasonry are really through his efforts and of working with something we call the Scottish Rite. But we also know he's a member of this society and organization, and it seems very evident that the stuff that he wrote about Freemason, his involvement with it, his passion for that sort of thing, certainly went into this organization. So it seems undeniable that, to a degree, these two things are linked.
Well, we know that Albert Pike wrote Morals and Dogma, and that has caused controversy ever since. So we're not going to go into that today. But we also know there are other members like John Quitman, who was a lawyer and politician and very well respected around that time. In fact, out of the 19 members known in Texas of the Knights of the Golden Circle, 30 of those were Freemasons. Even more worryingly, a man called Nathan Bedford Forrest did his first degree in Freemasonry, but he did never return. However, he did go on to form the KKK. Now, this starts to get a bit murky and starts to worry me, really, because there are strong links here with the Ku Klux Klan and members, again, being in both societies. They got their name from the Greek word kluklos, and that means circle and clan, Ku Klux Klan. Knights of the Clan of the Circle. It's all getting very, very close and something quite uncomfortable for me. When I look even further, the logo of the KGC was altered and just transmuted into the KKK logo. They're very, very similar. You can see how the influence of different people from one side being Freemasonry through the Knights of the Golden Circle into the other side of the KKK. Now, my concern and worry, I suppose, is that did Albert Pike influence this structure? He's known to have been in all three of these orders, and it's certainly said that he is, although trying to find proof of these things is often very difficult. But did he help them with codes and ciphers and the idea of the circle? Because everything seems to be that way inclined.
Oh, yeah. No, I'd go back to what you said about it is unnerving to have these things connected in the sense of the organisation, the KKK, and of course Freemasonry in any context being linked to that. It's a very uncomfortable situation to be discussing, or to even have in reality for people to go off and research stuff. But if you're going to the question of does Albert Pike have an influence, I think unquestionably yes. I mean, just because of his presence within both the fraternity, his interests, and what seems to be evident in how the structure actually was. But, we can't ignore the concepts of reading too much in the circle. As we know, we have a circle is an important device within Freemasonry itself. But there was the part that this circle was this geographical one, where you're looking at the bottom of Southern America. You've got the peninsula coming through to the south of America as the continent, and then you're coming up towards the Yucatan. This is meant to be this symbolic circle, which originally was a country. But as you say, the dynamics changed. This idea of invading south was the original part of the KGC. It then got involved with the war with the North, which we know then changed its agenda from financing an invasion of the further south to actually defending itself from the North. And I think what we're looking at there, in this case, we're looking at the more they say so, this challenge towards their ability of how they lived, which of course is based on this financial part with slavery. So yeah, we have to look at the circular part, and I think we also have to look at any kind of moral justification. And it's awkward to say it, but we have to say that part of context. I can only talk about what morals and ethics means to me at this particular time. It's difficult to think of what was the moral and ethical levels of another man, another county, another country, leading to a different level. I mean, there's a justification that goes in there, although it's abhorrent to us now. Is there a possibility that in 50 years' time, people will look back at Freemasonry today and go, how could you be there? Had you be in a society where there was a segregation between men and women? How could you even contemplate that? But, I feel comfortable with that exchange. There is female masonry, there's mixed masonry, the options are there. But to be a member of a male-only society, I can understand in 50 years' time, maybe we'll be questioned in the same way as we're now questioning slavery. I know it's an awkward thing to say, but it's a reality of how things grow and develop. But it doesn't go back to the sense of... It doesn't ignore the sense of going back and seeing the disturbing part of this evolution. But yeah, I would say that Pike's influence is there, and it's not just with the literature, and it's not just with the circle. I mean, there's that famous triangle 357. How more Masonic can you get? I mean, that's almost unique to us. Well, I would have thought it was unique to us until I was reading this stuff. So 357 in a triangle. Ooh.
Well, that is featured on the front of the expose book. And it's a triangle with a 3, 5 and 7 in it, as you say, in each corner. But if we add 3, 5 and 7 together, we get 15, which is the 15 Confederate States. There's also an R61 right in the middle, which is apparently supposed to signify the revolution in 1861. But I'm not 100% convinced. In fact, I'm not convinced of a lot of this stuff, but I want to tell you guys so that you can go away and look at it yourself. 3, 5 and 7 in Freemasonry is a really, really well-known structure. It's the rule of 3 to rule a lodge. You have 5 who would then hold a lodge, or 7 that would make it perfect. Now, at the time they were using the Preston ritual, which completely signified that. We also have the 3, 5 and 7 steps. It's the 3 Grand Masters, the 5 noble orders of architecture, and 7 years it took King Solomon to complete the temple. We also see depictions now of some steps with 3 degrees. At the start, we'd have 3 steps for the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason. The next 5 would be for architecture, and the 7 would be the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And again, if you're looking at some Masonic photos or some drawings, you'll often come across these. But what I find really interesting about the KGC is their regalia. In the expose book, there's a picture, and the guy is wearing a helmet with a spear on the top and a silver crescent at the bottom. Now, this is talked about within the text, and I go into quite a bit of detail about these symbols. In fact, the crescent is a new moon with 15 stars on it to represent the growing Confederacy. They use a skull and crossbones, and again in the book they tell you that this is to represent death to everybody who opposes the Southern independence. Now, again, I can't quite get on board with that. The skull and crossbones has been used across lots of secret societies over the ages to really mean a memento mori, and I would imagine it continues to be that within that society. And maybe this guy who wrote the book wasn't initiated enough to quite understand. One thing we do see, though, is the hilarious posing for photos. We often get this. We'd often see that Beyonce, Jay-Z, or President Clinton was pulling a stupid pose while he was taking a photo, and everybody believes that they are then part of the Illuminati. And we start to see this with the KGC. In fact, you'll often see pictures of them holding their fingers like this to form a circle. Could be true. There's another one with the hand across the chest. Again, not 100% convinced, because you will see that in other places. But Masons do like to hide things. They like to have fun with this stuff. And in England in those times, the great cathedrals were being built and churches were being built, and they would hide things in stone. However, in America, that wasn't so common. In fact, a lot of things were built with wood. So were they hiding things in trees? Our next episode is going to be about the Civil War gold. But I want to hear if you think, Duncan, they were hiding anything within trees or carving things on wood.
That's unfair. You leave me in to talk about something you've actually told me I'm not allowed to talk about. That's just cruel. But to answer the question, yes, I do. But apparently we've got to wait until the second episode to talk about it. But regarding all the stuff you let me talk about, which is, I do think that there's this smoking gun towards Pike. If not Pike, then some of the leading people in or influential people in Freemasonry, because of this 357. It's an element of our ritual, and very much from a guy called William Preston, who possibly wrote the most influential book in Freemasonry at all, because all the rituals that we have today are very much impressed by or structured around his ideals, whether we like it or not. He was a guy who wrote a book that pointed out that Freemasonry and its rituals weren't simple just ethical and moral lessons, that they themselves were a work of art, and a work of art styled in a way that only a intellectual man could really appreciate. And so becoming a Mason not only made you seen as an ethical person, it also meant you were intellectual. Rightly or wrongly, that's the persona he actually gave. And one of the tools he used for that is he took this 3, 5, and 7 and related it also to the 7 liberal arts, which is grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Now, these are classical arts, but technically they're split up in certain ways. There's this thing called the Trivium, which is the first 3, which is logic, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which is about literature and understanding, speaking, and speaking well. And that's called the Trivium, the first 3. So you've got the 3 of the 7. The most important science, especially when you're looking at some of the rituals, especially from the early ones, was geometry, which is the 5th science. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then, of course, the total of sciences is 7. So you have 3, 5, and 7. And in Preston's work, and then by Webb Smith, which was popular in America, this was very much endorsed. And so it's such a unique collection of numbers. We could look at prime numbers as well. But this is, it's a smoking gun for me. And this concept of this portraying of wanting to seem intellectual, I think it might be an erroneously, but it's one that I kind of like, is because they're obviously the KJC is also linked with the assassination of President Lincoln. Now, we could go through all the conspiracy theories on that, and that would be immense. But of course, you do have Wilkes Booth. And one of the things he does, he jumps off after shooting Lincoln, jumps on the stage and shouts out, was it Sing Temper Tyrannus, which is Latin. I mean, it's not a spoken language. It's a literature language. But to speak in Latin or to know Latin is quite an intellectual thing, even at this sort of stage. And so he does it, which seems to perpetuate this idea of people wanting to be seen as intellectual, to want to be seen as intellectuals, this superior-like feeling. And so I see it in that sort of way. I do see the society trying to emulate that they're moral, that they're intellectual, they are in their divine rights to do what they're actually doing, which is, again, it's kind of scary because it's then this mentality of justification that goes on for these, what we see as, well, obviously assassination is a horrific act. And of course, we're looking at slavery and this oppression again. But there is this continuing concept of justification that goes through, which, unfortunately, it looks like the use of Freemasonry to do it, which is shameful. It's shameful to look back and see it.
I have to agree with you on how shameful that is, but what I really want to get into here is the assassination of Lincoln, because there is lots and lots of evidence that the police and the government on that evening didn't protect him at all. Now, this is enough to go into a whole other episode. Again, here at Minerva, we try not to go into too much detail to keep these videos short so that you can go away and find out for yourselves. They're to tease you, I suppose. But there was a bodyguard that was supposed to be put with Lincoln on the evening, and he was not there. So again, if you want to hear more about that, please do leave a comment and we can look to do that as an episode in the future. One thing I will say, though, is that the Knights of the Golden Circle, or many of them, wanted Lincoln to become the president. And they wanted him to become the president so it would fire up the other members, probably the members who were least passionate, to really going into action, because they felt that that's the way that they would be able to turn and really bring the fight. We see the member John Wilkes Booth, who is said that he's a member, but again, we can't always prove these things. It's very difficult. And the rumour goes that he was put up to going and killing Lincoln by the KGC. Another controversial figure, while we're on that subject, is Jesse James, the well-known outlaw, again said to be a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, Jesse James is a name which may be attributed to a number of people, but most people will say that he was a guy that was going out and taking money and robbing people and sort of trying to raise funds for this Confederate fight. His job was almost to steal and run that treasury, because when you look at the amount that he stole and all of the facts and figures around that, he wasn't flash, he wasn't rich, he seemed to steal a lot but do very little with it. And of course, was that going into the coffers of the KGC? Now, our next episode, as we've said already, is going to be on the Confederate gold. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But for now, I'd like to know what happened to the KGC. Where did they go? Did they just fade out after the Civil War? Did they become the KKK, which went on and is still continuing today? Is it still alive now? When you look at the history books and you sort of search around for this stuff, it appears to get rebranded in 1863 as the Order of American Knights. Now, that then a year later becomes another society called the Order of the Sons of Liberty, and then just seems to fade out. I know what my belief on where the KGC are, but what about you, Duncan? Where do you think they are, or what happened to them?
Yeah, no, there's so much to say on that front. I mean, let's go with the Jesse James things first. You hinted on it, says, was there only one Jesse James? There's already many theories that there wasn't just one Jesse James, and it kind of makes sense. One of my favourite films when I was a kid was The Princess Bride, and there's a character called the dreaded Pirate Roberts, and the idea was that every time the dreaded Pirate Roberts became immensely rich, he retired and he gave the title to somebody else, and so somebody else took on the reins. And of course, it was the fear of this character that made this, whoever had the title to be successful. So you can imagine that if someone was a robber and wanted to be this successful, I'm actually Jesse James, because you're looking at a country where you haven't got the exposure of photographs as we have now, and there's an ambiguity how people looked. And equally, if someone was being robbed and they went back, so who'd you get robbed by? If I got robbed by Jesse James, then of course it changes the scenario of things. And so, was there one person? So we could say he stole so much. It's more of a case of so much was stolen in his name, whether it was relevant to him. But I'm not an American historian, so I can't validate any of those parts. As for what happened to the KGC, I should say, at the end of the Civil War, I think we have to take into account their own changes of what we know to begin with, where, of course, as we said at the beginning, it's a political movement trying to invade or promoting the invasion of of South America, the northern part of real South America, the continent, rather than Southern America. And that changed when it ended up being in a war with the North. So we see a change in its action. We see a political change in the sense of holding on to its homesteads, and its way of actual living. And I can imagine what happens here. We then have another transition where they've lost the war. They've lost the power to, one, save their own way of living. And they've lost the ability to regroup and go back to stage one, which was to invade further south. So I imagine we're looking at almost like a sense of divide, where those who were more motivated about the race issue, those ones would have gone off into the KKK and just perpetuated that. They found a voice and a channel to almost disgustingly fight for this concept that they believed in. And the others went to the stage of, right, we have to live with what now has happened. We've lost the glory of trying to invade South. We've lost the ability to exist as we did. And so that goes into another part of it. One thing I do like the idea of, and it's pure playing with letters, this case, of course, can't say too much of it because it's the next episode and we're talking about money trees, etc., is the idea of them becoming the Order of American Knights. Because, of course, taking the principal letters of Order American Knights, you get the word, get the letters for the word oak. So it would be nice to think if the trees that they were hiding their the treasure under were actually oak trees, and the little wink of the eye saying, we are the Order of American Knights, hint hint. But can't say anything. Next episode, Stum.
Well, this is really difficult because, as you know, the next episode is going to be about the Confederate gold, and these two things are linked so closely, but we wanted to split them into 2 episodes so that we could give you as much detail as possible. Now, my theory on whether or not the KGC still survived is kind of changing all the time. The more I read, the more I learn, the more I kind of change my opinion and go left and right with it. You know, on one hand, did they lose the hearts and sort of minds of the soldiers who just gave up after the war? That would seem pretty sensible. But there's also this thing about them hiding their gold and their money, and were they waiting for a resurgence? You know, will the South rise again? Which keeps coming back to me and thinking, you know what, there might still be some of them out there. So, as I've said, our next episode is going to be on that Civil War gold. Please do like and subscribe so that you can see that episode in the future. And please give us a comment on where you think the KGC are, what you feel about them, and your opinions on this whole subject, because for us it's been absolutely fascinating. You know, on the next episode we will talk about whether or not some people are out there still guarding this stuff, and whether or not there will be some future finds. So, great to see you, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next episode.